The wind cut through everything in the winter of 1878. A homesteader in the Midwest frontier learned that the hard way when his neighbor's cabin dropped 30 degrees inside every time someone opened the front door to fetch firewood or check livestock. The neighbor had built exactly like every settler was told to build. Single door log cabin, tight corners, wood stove inside, standard and proven. But during windstorms, warm air rushed out, cold air poured in, and they burned through 4 cords of wood in 2 weeks just trying to stay warm. Across the frontier, families were losing the same battle in cabins built by the book. The homesteader quietly added what neighbors mocked as a useless tiny hallway to his own cabin. That small change kept his home 25 degrees warmer than standard cabins during the next major storm. What did he understand about moving air that every serious builder today should know? The homesteader watched his breath freeze in the air inside his own cabin that December morning, ice crystals forming on the log walls despite the wood stove burning steadily 3 feet away. Outside, the wind howled across the prairie and through the scattered stands of pine that marked the edge of timber country, driving snow horizontally against the single-pane window he had managed to install before the deep cold set in. This was his second winter on the claim, 160 acres of mixed grassland and forest that stretched toward the distant mountains, and he was beginning to understand why so many families packed up and headed back east come spring. The land itself held promise: good timber for building, a creek that ran year-round, soil that would grow corn and wheat once cleared and broken. But the winters tested everything a man thought he knew about staying warm. Snow began falling in late October and rarely melted completely until April. By December, nighttime temperatures dropped well below zero and stayed there for weeks. Windstorms swept down from the northwest with gusts that could knock a man flat, driving cold through every crack and gap in even the best-built structures. Every settler in the area had built the same way because it was the only way anyone knew. Cut logs from the nearest stand of pine or oak, notch the corners with an axe, stack them into a rectangle roughly 16 feet by 18 feet, and fill the gaps with whatever mud and moss could be scraped together. Frame a door in the center of one gable end, cut a hole for a stovepipe, lay down a plank floor if lumber could be spared, or pack the dirt hard if it could not. The whole structure could be raised in a week with help from neighbors, using tools every frontier carpenter carried and methods passed down from fathers who had cleared land in Ohio and Indiana a generation earlier. It was practical, proven, and fast. Most families planned to live in these cabins for just a few years while they built up their farms and saved money for a proper frame house with multiple rooms and real windows. The cabins were meant to be temporary, functional shelters that would keep out rain and snow while a family established their claim and learned the land. Comfort was a luxury that could wait, but the homesteader had noticed something troubling as he visited neighbors and watched them struggle through their first winters. Every time someone opened the front door, the cabin transformed from shelter to wind tunnel. The moment that single entry swung wide, warm air rushed out like water from a broken dam, and frigid air poured in to take its place. Stoves that had been maintaining a comfortable temperature suddenly roared and strained to reheat the entire space. Families huddled in blankets, waiting for the cabin to warm again, burning through precious firewood at an alarming rate. He had seen it happen at the Morrison place during a blizzard in January. The family needed to bring in firewood every few hours to keep their stove fed, but each trip to the woodpile cost them dearly. Mrs. Morrison would crack the door and slip out quickly, but the damage was immediate and severe. The temperature near the door dropped 30 degrees in seconds. Frost formed on the inside walls. The baby cried from the sudden chill, and it took nearly an hour of steady burning to restore warmth to the corners of the cabin. The homesteader's own family had experienced the same shock when he ventured out to check on their livestock during a particularly vicious storm. The moment he opened the door, cold air hit his chest like a physical blow, and he could hear his wife gasp as the chill reached their sleeping area in the back corner of the cabin. His young son woke crying, and the homesteader realized that his family was just as vulnerable as every other household trying to survive with this standard design. But unlike his neighbors, the homesteader carried memories that suggested a different approach. His grandfather had emigrated from the German regions of Pennsylvania, bringing with him stories of the thick-walled houses his own father had known in the old country. These structures had small entry chambers, unheated spaces between the outer door and the main living area. His grandfather called them winter rooms, places where cold air could settle and be contained before it reached the family's warmth. The homesteader had also spent 2 winters working in logging camps in Minnesota, where he had seen similar arrangements in the bunkhouses. The smartest camp bosses built small mudrooms at the entries to their buildings, understanding that lumberjacks coming and going at all hours needed a buffer zone to prevent heat loss. These unheated chambers were crude and simple, but they worked. As he considered his options that winter, the homesteader began to sketch rough plans in the margins of his almanac. A small room, perhaps 4 feet by 4 feet, built onto the front of his cabin. 2 doors instead of 1. An outer door opening from the weather into this small space, and an inner door leading into the main living area. The concept was simple enough that he could build it himself with materials left over from his cabin construction, but it represented a fundamental challenge to accepted frontier wisdom. When he mentioned the idea to neighbors during a community gathering at the schoolhouse, their reaction was swift and dismissive. "That's wasted lumber and space," declared Tom Fletcher, whose own cabin leaked heat so badly his family slept in their coats. "Just another door to freeze open and more boards you'll never get back. In this country, you burn wood, not build halls." Others were even more skeptical. The idea struck them as fancy and impractical, something a man might consider if he had money to waste, but pointless for families just trying to survive until spring. Sarah Mitchell, whose husband had died the previous winter and left her to manage their claim alone, shook her head when the homesteader described his plan. "We're not building mansions here," she said. "We're trying to stay alive with what we've got." The criticism stung because it came from people he respected, families who had endured the same hardships and understood the brutal mathematics of frontier survival. Every board cost money or labor. Every day spent on improvements was a day not spent on essential work. But the homesteader could not shake the conviction that there had to be a better way than simply accepting heat loss as the price of survival. That spring, the homesteader found his teacher in an unexpected place. Lars Andersen had arrived from Norway 3 years earlier and settled on a claim 8 miles north, closer to the foothills where the timber grew thicker and the wind hit even harder. Unlike most settlers who struggled through their first winters, Andersen's cabin had earned a reputation for staying warm with remarkably little firewood. When the homesteader visited to trade labor for advice, he discovered techniques that made his grandfather's stories seem like half-remembered fragments of a much larger system. Andersen's log walls looked similar from a distance, but up close they revealed crucial differences. Where most settlers filled gaps between logs with whatever mud they could scrape together, Andersen had created a 3-layer seal that stopped air movement completely. He began with sphagnum moss, the gray-green material that grew thick in the wetlands near his claim. This moss, when stuffed tightly into the spaces between logs, expanded when damp and created an initial barrier against drafts. Over the moss, Andersen applied a mixture of clay-rich soil and water, worked into a thick paste, and pressed deep into every crack with his fingers. The clay formed a continuous seal that dried hard and smooth, turning the random gaps between logs into a uniform surface. But the 3rd layer made the real difference. Andersen mixed chopped straw with more clay and a small amount of horse manure, creating what he called daub. This final coating, applied with a wooden paddle and smoothed by hand, dried into a plaster-like surface that sealed completely against wind-driven air infiltration. The homesteader watched Andersen demonstrate the technique on a section of wall that had been damaged by spring frost. The Norwegian worked methodically, stuffing moss until it protruded slightly from the gaps, then pressing clay mixture over it with steady pressure. The straw clay daub went on last, smoothed until it blended seamlessly with the log surfaces above and below. When finished, the wall presented an unbroken barrier with no visible gaps or cracks. But Andersen's most surprising technique involved the foundation itself. While most settlers built their cabins with the bottom logs resting directly on stone footings, Anderson had banked earth around the entire perimeter of his structure. Soil and packed sod rose nearly 18 inches up the exterior walls, creating a continuous skirt that eliminated the gap between the lowest logs and the ground where cold air typically infiltrated from below. The earthen banking served multiple purposes that became clear as Anderson explained his reasoning. Ground temperatures remained more stable than air temperatures, even in deep winter. By surrounding the bottom portion of his walls with earth, he created insulation that prevented conductive heat loss through the logs and blocked the horizontal movement of cold air under the structure. The banking also shed water away from the foundation, preventing moisture problems that could weaken the lowest logs and create gaps as wood swelled and contracted. Anderson had learned these techniques in the Hardanger region of western Norway, where winter temperatures dropped as low as the American frontier and stayed there longer. His father had built their family home using methods passed down through generations of farmers who understood that surviving northern winters required more than thick walls and hot fires. Air movement was the enemy, and every surface where outside air could reach inside air had to be sealed completely. The homesteader spent 3 days helping Anderson repair and improve his chinking, learning to feel for air movement with his hands and identify the subtle gaps that allowed heat to escape. They worked from the inside during the day, then walked around the exterior at dusk when temperature differences made drafts more noticeable. Anderson taught him to look for discolored wood where moisture had condensed, dark stains that marked the paths of air infiltration that needed immediate attention. Armed with these new techniques, the homesteader returned to his own cabin as summer building season began. He started with the foundation banking, hauling wheelbarrow loads of clay-rich soil from a hillside deposit near his creek. The work proved more labor-intensive than he had anticipated. Creating an 18-inch bank around a 16 by 18-foot cabin required nearly 12 cubic yards of material, all of which had to be dug, transported, and shaped by hand. He graded the banking carefully to shed water away from the walls while maintaining continuous coverage around the entire perimeter. Where his cabin sat on uneven ground, he built up low areas with additional soil and rock, ensuring that the earth bank presented a smooth surface that cold air could not penetrate. The work took 2 weeks of evening labor after his regular farming chores, but the results became apparent immediately. During the first cold snap of early fall, the homesteader noticed that his cabin floor stayed noticeably warmer than in previous years. The constant chill that had risen from below, making the space near his feet uncomfortable even when the stove burned hot, had disappeared. Temperature measurements with a simple mercury thermometer showed the difference clearly. Where his floor had previously remained 15 to 20 degrees colder than the air near his stove, the gap had narrowed to just 5 degrees. The chinking work took another month of careful attention. The homesteader gathered moss from marshy areas along his creek, dried it partially to make it easier to handle, then spent hours working it into every visible gap in his log walls. The clay-soil mixture required experimentation to achieve the right consistency. Too thin, and it would not stay in place. Too thick, and it cracked as it dried. He found that adding just enough water to make the clay moldable while keeping it stiff enough to support its own weight produced the best results. The straw clay daub proved the most challenging layer to master. The mixture required precise proportions to achieve the right binding strength and smooth finish. Too much straw, and the coating remained rough and uneven. Too little, and it lacked the fibrous strength to resist cracking. After several failed attempts, the homesteader learned to mix small batches and apply them immediately before the clay began to set. When he completed the wall ceiling in late September, the transformation was remarkable. His cabin walls presented smooth, continuous surfaces with no visible gaps or air paths. The structure felt different inside, more solid and enclosed. Even before winter arrived, he could sense that the building would hold heat more effectively and resist the penetrating cold that had made previous winters so difficult to endure. With his cabin shell now sealed against continuous air leaks, the homesteader turned his attention to the intermittent but devastating heat loss that occurred every time his family needed to venture outside. October brought the first hard frosts, and he began construction of the small anteroom that would either validate his theory or prove his neighbors correct about wasted lumber. The vestibule design required careful planning to maximize function while minimizing materials. He settled on interior dimensions of 4 feet by 4 feet, large enough for a person to step inside and close the outer door before opening the inner door, but small enough to avoid consuming significant lumber or floor space. The structure would attach to the existing front wall of his cabin, requiring him to relocate his current door opening and frame 2 new doorways. Construction began with extending his foundation stones to support the additional structure. The homesteader quarried flat limestone from an outcrop near his creek, selecting pieces that would provide stable footings for the 4 corners of the vestibule. He dug foundation holes 18 inches deep to reach below the frost line, then laid the stones level using a water-filled wooden tube as a primitive level. The foundation work took 3 days, but proper footings proved essential for preventing the small structure from shifting during freeze-thaw cycles. Framing the vestibule required techniques slightly different from log construction. The homesteader built a timber frame using posts and beams joined with mortise and tenon joints, a method he had learned from his father, who had worked as a barn builder in Ohio. The frame consisted of 4 corner posts, each 6 inches square and 7 feet tall, connected by horizontal plates at the top and bottom. Diagonal braces cut from smaller timbers provided stability against wind loads. The most critical aspect of the construction involved creating 2 properly fitted doorways. The homesteader rehung his existing cabin door as the inner door, sealing the old opening completely and cutting a new doorway between the main cabin and the vestibule. This inner door opened inward to the main living space, allowing warm air to stay trapped when someone entered the vestibule from outside. For the outer door, he built a new frame using lumber milled from oak trees on his property. This door needed to fit tightly against weather seals while remaining easy to operate in winter conditions. He carved leather hinges and fashioned a simple thumb latch that would function even when ice formed around the mechanism. The outer door opened outward, preventing snow from blocking the entrance and ensuring that wind pressure would push the door tighter against its frame rather than forcing it open. Wall construction combined board and batten siding with careful attention to air sealing. The homesteader covered the timber frame with vertical boards, then nailed narrow strips over the joints between boards to prevent air infiltration. He sealed every joint with the same clay straw mixture he had used for chinking his main cabin walls, creating a continuous barrier against drafts. The floor consisted of thick pine planks laid over joists, elevated slightly above grade to prevent moisture problems. The roof presented unique challenges because it needed to shed water while connecting seamlessly to the existing cabin roof. The homesteader built a shed roof that sloped away from the main cabin using split shingles made from straight-grained pine logs. He sealed the junction between the new roof and the cabin wall with strips of birch bark held in place with wooden battens, a technique he had observed in Native American constructions. When construction finished in late November, the homesteader began systematic testing to measure the vestibule's effectiveness. Using a mercury thermometer borrowed from the school teacher, he recorded interior temperatures before, during, and after door openings under various weather conditions. The results proved dramatic and immediately measurable. On a calm day with outdoor temperatures around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, opening the old direct entry door had caused interior temperatures to drop from 68 degrees to 42 degrees within 2 minutes. The cabin required nearly an hour to return to comfortable temperature, during which the stove consumed extra firewood and the family endured significant discomfort. With the vestibule system in place, the same outdoor conditions produced vastly different results. Opening the outer door into the vestibule caused no measurable temperature change in the main cabin. When someone then opened the inner door, the main room temperature dropped only to 58 degrees, and recovery occurred within 15 minutes. The difference represented a fundamental change in how the cabin responded to human activity. The physics of the system became clear through repeated observation. Cold air entering the vestibule settled toward the floor of the small, unheated space, where it remained trapped when both doors were closed. The vestibule acted as a collection chamber for cold air that would otherwise sweep directly into the living space. When someone opened the inner door, only the small volume of the vestibule exchanged air with the main cabin, rather than creating a direct pathway between interior warmth and exterior cold. Wind conditions amplified the vestibule's effectiveness. During storms with gusts over 30 miles per hour, The old direct entry system had created interior temperature swings of 30 degrees or more with each door opening. The pressure differential between inside and outside caused warm air to rush out with explosive force, while cold air flooded in to replace it. The vestibule eliminated this pressure exchange by providing a neutral zone where air pressure could equalize gradually. The homesteader's wife noticed immediate improvements in daily comfort and household management. Tasks that required multiple trips outside, such as feeding livestock or bringing in firewood, no longer created cycles of chilling and reheating that disrupted cooking and sleeping. Children could play near the door without experiencing sudden temperature shocks when adults needed to go outside. Fuel consumption measurements confirmed the vestibule's efficiency gains. During a 2-week period of consistently cold weather, the homesteader's sealed cabin with vestibule consumed 1 3/4 cords of firewood compared to the 2 1/2 cords he had burned during a similar period the previous winter. The 30% reduction in fuel use translated directly to reduced labor cutting and hauling wood, as well as improved comfort for his family. The vestibule's temperature remained surprisingly stable despite being unheated. Even during the coldest nights when outdoor temperatures dropped below zero, the vestibule rarely fell more than 15 degrees below the main cabin temperature. The small enclosed space benefited from heat conducted through the inner door and walls, creating a moderate microclimate that made the transition from warm interior to cold exterior less shocking for anyone using the entry system. Even with his cabin sealed and the vestibule functioning perfectly, the homesteader faced a persistent challenge that emerged most clearly during the longest, coldest nights of December. His stove could maintain comfortable temperatures while burning actively, but when banked for overnight heating, the cabin still experienced dramatic temperature swings that left corners cold and floors near freezing by morning. The solution would require him to think beyond preventing heat loss to actually storing and managing the heat his stove produced. The homesteader's wife proved instrumental in developing the next phase of improvements. Mary had grown up in a Pennsylvania farmhouse where her mother had used heated stones to warm beds on winter nights. She understood that certain materials could absorb heat when available and release it slowly over hours, extending the useful life of each piece of firewood burned. Her knowledge of domestic heat management combined with her husband's building skills to create a system that transformed their cabin from a simple shelter into a heat battery. The first modification involved replacing sections of their plank floor with flat limestone slabs positioned strategically around the stove area. The homesteader quarried the stone from the same outcrop he had used for foundations, selecting pieces roughly 2 feet square and 3 inches thick. These slabs required careful fitting and leveling to create a smooth surface that would absorb maximum heat from the stove's radiant output. Installation proved more complex than the homesteader had anticipated. Each stone weighed nearly 80 pounds and needed to be positioned precisely to avoid gaps where cold air could infiltrate from below. He removed planks from a 6-foot by 8-foot area surrounding the stove, then excavated the packed earth underneath to create a level bed of sand and gravel. The stones were fitted together like puzzle pieces, with thin strips of clay pressed into joints to prevent air movement between slabs. The thermal properties of the stone floor became apparent within days of completion. During active burning, when the stove ran hot, to heat the cabin quickly, the limestone absorbed excess heat energy that would otherwise have been lost through the walls or ceiling. The stones remained warm to the touch for hours after the fire had been banked, radiating stored heat into the living space throughout the night. Temperature measurements revealed the dramatic difference the thermal mass created. On nights when outdoor temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero, the previous winter's wooden floor had fallen to 32 degrees by morning, despite continuous burning. The stone floor, absorbing heat during evening burning and releasing it slowly overnight, maintained temperatures between 45 and 50 degrees, even when the stove was reduced to glowing coals. Mary contributed the next innovation by adapting traditional bed warming techniques to whole room heating. She sewed heavy wool curtains that could be drawn across the single window at night, trapping a layer of still air against the glass to reduce conductive heat loss. More importantly, she created a system of hanging blankets that could section off the cabin interior, concentrating heat in smaller areas during extreme cold periods. The blanket barriers functioned like movable walls that allowed the family to heat only essential spaces during the coldest nights. Heavy canvas curtains suspended from ceiling hooks could isolate the sleeping area from the main room, creating a smaller volume of air that the stove could keep warm more efficiently. During moderately cold periods, the curtains remained open to allow heat circulation throughout the entire cabin. When temperatures plummeted, the family could close off unused areas and concentrate their heating efforts. The homesteader's most ambitious thermal modification involved constructing a heat storage wall behind his stove. Using techniques adapted from European masonry stove design, he built a shallow chamber filled with stones and clay that would absorb heat from the stove's back surface and chimney, then radiate that stored energy long after active burning had ceased. Construction required dismantling part of the cabin's rear wall to install the heat storage system. The homesteader built a wooden frame against the exterior wall, creating a chamber 18 inches deep and 4 feet wide that aligned with the stove's position. He filled this chamber with fist-sized stones interspersed with clay and sand, creating a dense thermal mass that could absorb significant amounts of heat energy. The heat storage wall connected to the stove through a series of metal pipes that channeled hot exhaust gases through the stone mass before allowing them to exit through the chimney. This system captured waste heat that would normally have been lost up the chimney and stored it in the thermal mass for gradual release over many hours. Field testing of the complete thermal management system took place during a severe cold snap in January when outdoor temperatures remained below zero for 10 consecutive days. The homesteader maintained detailed records of fuel consumption, interior temperatures, and heating patterns to measure the effectiveness of his innovations. Results exceeded his expectations. The combined thermal mass systems allowed the cabin to maintain comfortable temperatures with significantly less active burning. Instead of feeding the stove every 2 hours throughout the night, the family could bank the fire at bedtime and wake to interior temperatures still above 45 degrees. The stone floor remained warm enough to walk on comfortably, eliminating the shock of stepping onto frozen planks that had plagued previous winters. Fuel consumption dropped by an additional 20% beyond the savings already achieved through wall sealing and vestibule installation. Over the 10-day test period, the cabin used just over 1 cord of wood compared to nearly 2 cords consumed during a similar cold spell the previous winter. The cumulative fuel savings from all improvements now totaled almost 50%, representing substantial reductions in the labor required to cut, split, and haul firewood. The thermal mass also eliminated dangerous temperature swings that had previously threatened the family's health and safety. Before the improvements, overnight temperatures in sleeping areas had sometimes dropped low enough to freeze water containers and create condensation problems that led to mold and dampness. The stabilized temperatures maintained by thermal storage kept the cabin atmosphere consistently above the danger threshold. Mary observed that the improved heating system created better air quality throughout the cabin. The steady, moderate heat eliminated the cycle of overheating and cooling that had required frequent adjustments to clothing and bedding. Humidity levels remained more stable, reducing condensation on walls and preventing the respiratory irritation that had affected the family during previous winters. The heat storage wall proved particularly effective during windy conditions that had previously caused rapid heat loss despite the sealed walls and vestibule. Wind pressure could no longer strip away accumulated warmth because the thermal mass provided a reservoir of stored energy that continued radiating heat regardless of external weather conditions. The cabin had evolved from a structure dependent on continuous burning to one that could coast for hours on stored thermal energy. The ultimate test arrived in February of 1882, when a massive Arctic front descended from Canada and settled over the frontier for 16 consecutive days. Weather observers at the territorial capital recorded the storm as the most severe in recorded history, with sustained winds exceeding 40 miles per hour and overnight temperatures plummeting to 20 degrees below zero. Snow fell continuously for the first week, accumulating to depths that made travel between homesteads impossible, and forced families to rely entirely on whatever preparations they had made. The homesteader's wood supply, carefully calculated based on previous winter's consumption, proved adequate despite the unprecedented cold. His improved cabin consumed just over 2 cords during the entire storm period, maintaining interior temperatures that averaged 48 degrees during the coldest nights and reaching comfortable levels of 65 degrees during daytime burning. The thermal mass systems functioned exactly as designed, storing heat during active burning periods and releasing it gradually to prevent dangerous temperature drops when the stove burned low. His neighbors faced dramatically different circumstances. Tom Fletcher's family, living in a standard single-door cabin with conventional chinking, burned through 4 1/2 cords of wood during the same period and still struggled to maintain temperatures above freezing in their sleeping area. Fletcher spent entire days feeding his stove, breaking up furniture and fence posts when his firewood supply ran dangerously low. His wife and children huddled in blankets near the stove, unable to move freely around their cabin without experiencing painful cold. The Morrison cabin, built just 2 years earlier using accepted frontier methods, suffered even worse conditions. Without adequate chinking or foundation sealing, wind-driven cold infiltrated continuously despite their family's desperate efforts to plug gaps with rags and newspapers. Ice formed on interior walls within 3 feet of their stove, and water containers froze solid despite being positioned close to the heat source. Mrs. Morrison developed a persistent cough that lasted months after the storm, and their youngest child showed signs of frostbite on his fingers from sleeping in inadequately warmed bedding. Sarah Mitchell, managing her claim alone after her husband's death, faced the most perilous situation. Her cabin's single door opened directly into the living space, creating catastrophic heat loss every time she ventured outside to tend livestock or gather firewood. During the worst nights of the storm, she barricaded herself inside with her animals, sharing body heat with a milk cow and chickens to prevent freezing. Her wood supply, already limited by her inability to cut and haul large quantities alone, dwindled to nothing by the storm's 10th day. The homesteader's family, by contrast, maintained their normal routines throughout the crisis. Mary continued cooking regular meals, baking bread twice during the storm period, activities that would have been impossible in cabins where temperatures fluctuated wildly and fuel had to be conserved for basic survival heating. The children played comfortably on the warm stone floor, attending to their lessons and household chores without the constant disruption of adding wood to maintain minimal heat. Most remarkably, the homesteader's vestibule system allowed him to tend his livestock daily without subjecting his family to dangerous temperature shocks. The double-door entry meant he could venture outside multiple times for essential chores while maintaining stable interior conditions. His cattle and pigs survived the storm in better condition than neighboring livestock because they received consistent care and adequate feed throughout the crisis period. When the storm finally broke and travel became possible again, word of the dramatic differences in survival and comfort spread quickly through the scattered homestead community. Neighbors who had mocked the homesteader's useless hallway now arrived at his door seeking advice and detailed explanations of his techniques. Tom Fletcher, whose family had suffered through 2 weeks of near-starvation cold, asked for specific guidance on building a vestibule and improving his cabin's chinking. The homesteader shared his knowledge freely, demonstrating the moss clay daub chinking technique and explaining the principles behind thermal mass and air sealing. He walked neighbors through his cabin, pointing out the earthen banking, stone floors, and heat storage wall, while explaining how each element contributed to the overall system's effectiveness. Most visitors left with detailed sketches and material lists, determined to implement at least some improvements before the next winter. Within 6 months, 3 neighboring cabins had added vestibule entries, constructed using variations of the homesteader's design. Fletcher built the most elaborate version, creating a mudroom large enough to store winter clothing and boots in addition to serving as an airlock. The Morrison family added a simple 4x4-foot vestibule that dramatically reduced their heating costs and improved comfort during the following winter. Sarah Mitchell, working with help from other community members, retrofitted her cabin with improved chinking and a small vestibule that enabled her to manage her homestead independently. The modifications, completed during the summer of 1882, reduced her fuel requirements by nearly 40% and allowed her to maintain adequate warmth throughout the subsequent winter season. Local lumber suppliers began stocking materials specifically for cabin improvements, responding to increased demand for boards, suitable for vestibule construction, and clay-based chinking materials. The territorial newspaper published an article describing the innovations, spreading knowledge of the techniques to settlements across the region. The success of the homesteader's system influenced cabin design throughout the territory. By 1885, newly constructed homestead cabins routinely included small entry vestibules, and builders had begun incorporating thermal mass elements like stone hearth extensions and heat storage walls into their standard designs. The techniques became part of regional building tradition, passed down from experienced settlers to newcomers arriving to claim land. 20 years later, the wind cut through everything in the winter of 1878. A homesteader in the Midwest frontier learned that the hard way when his neighbor's cabin dropped 30 degrees inside every time someone opened the front door to fetch firewood or check livestock. The neighbor had built exactly like every settler was told to build. Single-door log cabin, tight corners, wood stove inside, standard and proven. But during windstorms, warm air rushed out, cold air poured in, and they burned through 4 cords of wood in 2 weeks just trying to stay warm. Across the frontier, families were losing the same battle in cabins built by the book. The homesteader quietly added what neighbors mocked as a useless tiny hallway to his own cabin. That small change kept his home 25 degrees warmer than standard cabins during the next major storm. What did he understand about moving air that every serious builder today should know? The homesteader watched his breath freeze in the air inside his own cabin that December morning, ice crystals forming on the log walls despite the wood stove burning steadily 3